Well, this one might be a little bit more rare. Old Norse. It should not come as a surprise, but I really do like ancient languages, and I really like Nordic languages. For quite some time now, did I want to learn the language of the ancient runes, the language of the Edda, although Edda is not written in the runic script, so that I may speak to Freya, Odin, or Thor in their native tongue, so to speak. Here, I must say, I do not have much knowledge of this wonderful language, just a little bit due to my study on, well, the English language history. So, it will be a completely new one. If I succeed in acquiring this magnificent language, as much as the resources are allowing it. Apparently, you still can get to a very advanced level in Old Norse. I can prove to you that my LAT, aka Language Acquisition Technique, does work, even for ancient languages. And I must say, I was honestly surprised for how many of the old languages you still can acquire a decent level. So, before we start, there's a short caution about phonetics. You see, Old Norse pronunciation is a reconstruction, so we will mostly have the Icelandic one. Since this marvelous language, Icelandic, has still a very similar phonology compared to the other Nordic languages. Now, Old Norse, the classical Old Norse or Old West Norse, as used in the Eddas and Sagas, is a fusional, inflected North Germanic language with a rich system of, and that is a little bit different from the previous languages, strong versus weak verbs. Don't worry, we will get there time. Preterite present verbs, 4 grammatical cases, 3 genders, 2 numbers, so no dual here either, and a morphology-driven syntax that allows topical movement for emphasis. Beginning with the verbal system. Again, each verb has 5 grammatical categories. Beginning with the first, which is person. Here we have first, second, and third. Then number. Here we have singular and plural, and not really a productive dual, but sometimes there is a dual in Old Norse, yet we do not need to worry about this at all. And then mood. Here we have indicative, subjunctive, and imperative. Now, the subjunctive is used for optative, which is wishful, idealis, well, not real, and certain dependent clauses. As for the tenses, we have present and past preterite. Now, periphrastic, which means more than one element, perfect, plusquamperfect, and future are all formed with auxiliaries. So, for example, hava, meaning to have, and vera, meaning to be. This auxiliary plus past participle. So, these express perfect or resultant or anterior temporal relations. As for the voice, mainly active, and the passive is expressed in 2 different ways. Synthetic, which means just one element, just a verb. So, syntactic passive, which is reflexive or passive morphology in some forms. And again, periphrastic, which means more than one element, passive, with vera plus the past participle or reflexive markers. And lastly, aspect and modality. And those are encoded by auxiliary combinations, periphrastic constructions, and the distinction between strong and weak verbs. So, aspectual differences often result from stem formation and upload. Next, Let's briefly look at verb classes and special types. So, the strong verbs form past tense by upload, which is a vowel alternation. Functionally, they often encode core lexical verbs. For example, sing, take, or go, those kind of types. And then weak verbs, and they form past by dental suffix. For example, an d or t type as a marker. And then better read present verbs. Those verbs whose present forms historically derive from a past form and thus behave like models. They often have present meaning with past form morphology and form their past like weak verbs. And these include common, modal or auxiliary meanings in the language. And verbal derivation, so causative, denominative and factitive formations exist, often by suffixation, which means there is a word attached at the end, or stem formation. Participles and verbal nouns are important for periphrastic constructions. Again, those are those constructions with more than one element. Next, the non-finite forms. So we have the infinitive, the citation form, which is used with auxiliaries and verbal complements. Then, of course, the participles. And those are present participle, active, ongoing sense, past participle, result or state, and are used adjectively, which means as an adjective, and in periphrastic tenses, as discussed earlier. And the gerunds, or verbal nouns. And they are less morphologically complex than Latin, but present as the verbal nouns and uses in subordinate clauses. So, with all of this, here's a quick functional summary. Basically, when to use what. So, use indicative for factual statements and narrative. Use subjunctive for indirect speech, potential or idealis contexts, wishes, again optative, and certain subordinate classes. Use imperative for commands. Use strong versus weak distinction to anticipate irregular past tense versus dental pasts. And finally, use periphrastic perfect or plusquamperfect, which means auxiliary plus participle, to express resultant states or anteriority, which means stuff that happened before something in the past. And now on to the nominal system. Beginning with genders, we have masculine, feminine, and neuter. Gender is mostly lexical, and the agreement for adjectives, pronouns, and participles follow gender, number, and case, similar to Latin. Then, as for the numbers, again, singular and plural. And dual is not that productive in Old Norse, which means it is not so often in use. And then, as for the cases, so we have nominative, simply who or what, grammatical subject, predicate, and noun or adjective. And then we have genitive, of whom or of what. This is simple possession, but also partitive relations and many attributive relationships. Again, slightly similar to Latin. Then we have dative, to whom or for whom, as well as by what or with what. Here again, indirect object, instruments, recipients, and many adverbial or even locative uses. Again, similar to Latin. And lastly, accusative, whom or what. That is the direct object, as well as goal of motion and many adverbial functions. So again, similar to Latin. So, the vocative was not a distinct, full, productive case for all paradigms, but it still addressed forms often coincident with the nominative or show just minor shape difference. So, now to the declensional classes. You see, nouns fall into stem classes. We have R stems, E stems, U stems, root or consonant stems, and N stems, which determine their case endings and gender tendencies. Adjectives follow declensional patterns that agree for, again, gender, number, and case with their head noun. And lastly, functional contrast. So, accusative versus dative. You see, accusative usually marks the direct object and motion toward something. Dative, on the other hand, marks the indirect objects and many oblique roles, such as means, manner, and instrument. Yet, idioms vary, and many English prepositional meanings map to, yet again, dative. Then the genitive. You see again, beyond possession, we have partitive, description, and complement relations, for example, certain prepositions and genitive objects. And agreement, as already said, adjectives and determiners, agree in gender, number, and case. So you see, we do have a lot of similarities with the Latin language. Anti-syntactic signposts. Here we can be really quick, beginning with the word order. Like Latin, Old Norse allows flexible word order, again because of morphology. You see, morphology marks grammatical relations. Yet, finite verbs often appear in early or second position in main clauses, and fronting is used for topic or focus, basically as pragmatic factors such as topicalization or emphasis. Those pragmatic factors shape surface order. And lastly, subordination. You see, subordinate clauses use finite or subjunctive distinction for modality, and relative clauses commonly use relative pronouns or particles. So, with that out of the way, we can now finish with the alphabet and the pronunciation. We will have a more dedicated video about the runes themselves. There are 3 different writing systems, kinda. So, starting with the younger Huthark during the Viking Age, consisting out of 16 runes. As you may already can see, similar to the alphabet, which has its name by the first 2 letters, the Huthark has the first 6 runic symbols as their name giver. So we have V, U, V, A, R, K, H, N, I, A, S, T, B, M, L, R. A rather beautiful writing system, isn't it? So, this one was used for the Old Norse language during the Viking Age, which was approximately 800 and 1610s AD. This alphabet was simplified from the elder Huthark, with some runes representing multiple sounds, and long vowels often not distinguished in writing at all. Then we have the elder Huthark with 24 symbols. Here we have V, U, V, A, R, K, G, V, H, N, I, J, I, P, Z, Z, T, B, E, M, L, N, D, O. So, this one was used for earlier Germanic languages, including Proto-Norse. And this was the original runic alphabet, arranged in 3 groups of 8, known as Aetir. It was superseded in Scandinavia by the younger Huthark around the 8th century. And then we have the Old English version, basically a Latinized version, which I will use here as well. So, Old Norse had 9 basic vowel sounds, which might be long or short, nasal or oral, giving us 36 potential distinctions. But the nasal part has been lost around 1200, and the length is indicated via the acute, which is this symbol here. So, beginning with the vowels then. Again, we have a distinction between the long version and the short version. A, for example, ar, which means year, and a, for example, in dagr, which means day. E, for example, el, which means storm. E, for example, ben, which means wound. E, for example, litre, which means looks, as a verb. E, for example, litre, which means color. The only distinction here is the length of the vowel. O, for example, sol, which means sun. Or, for example, hov, which means temple. U, for example, hus, which means house. U, for example, sumar, which means summer. And then one of my favorite sounds, U, for example, kur, which means cow, and U, for example, ufir, which means over. And then I, for example, sire, which means sea. Then we have Ö, for example, ör, which means mad, and Ö, a shorter version of it, for example, dökr, which means dark. And then we have O, for example, in all, which means ale. And then the diphthongs. Au, for example, laus, which means loose. A, for example, bane, which means bone. And here it is a little bit more tricky. We have E plus U, but it is E, for example, hey, which means hey. The English word written with H-A-Y. And the consonants. Here again we have a short version and a long version. For example, B in beta, which means to bite, and B, for example, gab, which means mockery. D, for example, domer, which means judgment, and D, for example, in otr, which means point. Then the V sound. Here we have actually 2 versions. First, as in English, far. Here we have fe, which means money, and then we have a sound like the English very, for example, hav, which means ocean. Notice the position of the V in the word. Then, of course, we have the long version, which is then more like the English far again. For example, offre, which means offering. Then G. Here we have actually 3 versions. First, like the English go, for example, gefa, which means to give. Then, like the Scottish loch, for example, lacht, which means low, in the nominative or accusative, neuter singular. Then we have, like the Scottish loch, but voiced, for example, echa, to own. Then, even for the long version, we have 2 versions. First, like the English goal again, but longer, for example, egg, which means edge, and then again, like the Scottish loch, but longer, for example, clecht, which means clear. And then h, simple enough, for example, horn, which means horn. Then y, for example, javen, which means even and is an adjective. Then k, for example, kotre, which means cat. Also in the long version, k, for example, ekki, which means nothing. Then l, for example, nal, which means needle. L, for example, hellir, which means cave. Then for example, frammi, which means boldness. And for example, frammi, in front. Here again, only distinction is the length, in this case, of the Then here we have two versions again. First, the English sin. Here, for example, we have hrinda, which means the bush. The second one is like the sing. For example, hringr, which means ring. Then this is again like the English sin, but longer. For example, stain, which means stone. Then p, for example, öpa, which means to shout. And p, again, a little bit longer. For example, heppin, which means lucky. Then r, as in the Scottish English. For example, görra, which means to do. And then, of course, also the longer version, r, for example, very, which means worse. Then the s, as in English, this, for example, resa, which means to race. Also, longer version. For example, in as, which means beam. Then the t, for example, in don, which means tooth. Also, longer version, for example, not, which means night. And then v, like in the English win, for example, vera, again, if you remember, that means to be. Then the, like the English thin, for example, thilling, which means assembly. And then we have another the, like the English this. For example, jordr, which means earth. And then x, which are two sounds. Again, öx, which means axe. And z, which is again two sounds. For example, in English, bits. Example, gauze, which means property. Now, just a few notes to clear this all up. The F pronunciation. The first one, if you remember, occurs in the initial position, which means at the beginning of words. The second version of the sound, if you remember, the very version, in medial and final position, basically when it is not at the beginning. Then, for the g pronunciation, if you remember, the first one was go, g. This occurs in the initial position and immediately after n. The second one, if you remember, the Scottish loch one, immediately before s and t. And the third one, the voiced loch version, in all other positions. By the way, voiced means using the vocal cords. For example, in the English word bill versus pill, the b is voiced, the p is unvoiced. So, as for the longer pronunciation of g, the second version, which is again the Scottish loch version, this occurs immediately before s and t, and the first in all other positions. Then, for the n pronunciation, the second n, as in sing, occurs immediately before g or k, similar to English. Just listen carefully. So, note that in the combination ng, the g is pronounced, as in some forms of Northern English. And the s never sounded as English rise, always as in goose. It will be seen that h, th, and the, and the same vowels y and v are always short. And with that, that's it already for this first lesson.